Chapter 1021, Taming Impossible Puzzles 5. Selfra looked at the three of them, each in turn. The idealized love they sell you in stories is safe precisely because it doesn't exist. The real obsessive kind is dangerous precisely because it does. That's why the better version is the one you define for yourselves, the one that doesn't need to match any particular template to be and doesn't need to be relevant to anything outside the people in it. Mayo, in the chair, was noticeably quiet. It was the particular quiet of someone who had started to say something intelligently hidden in a joke, and had arrived, somewhere between the opening of her mouth and the closing of it, at the realization that there was nothing to add. I want you to understand that, in the first place, you don't need to find this so-called true love to have a healthy and lasting relationship, one that nourishes you and whoever you're with. I've calculated that more than half the people who have been in long relationships have been unfaithful at some point. A pause to let that land. And most of those who weren't didn't avoid it because of love. They avoided it because of fear, political convenience, loyalty to family, or not wanting to lose what they believe they had. Another pause. The instinct never goes away. You are always going to find other attractive people attractive, and so will he, no matter how much he loves the person or people who will be his partners. That doesn't make what you have false. It only means the instinct was always there and they chose not to follow it, which is different. And that doesn't invalidate everything if at some point the instinct doesn't let us be faithful in thought, said Leora. No, the answer arrived direct, without preamble, because we are what we are and we have to accept it. And because the decision not to follow the instinct is exactly the only thing you control in any of this. The instinct isn't going anywhere. And that doesn't mean what exists between you isn't real. It only means you're human and life is longer and more complex than it looks from the age you're at right now. Leora looked at the floor. Then what's the point of understanding the love you're describing if we can't feel it? She asked, quieter. Selfra smiled and took a moment. Nothing external, she said. Like perfect, idealized happiness that can only come from being grateful to be alive and for the opportunity to experience things. Like almost anything worth having. Real love lives inside you and depends entirely on how you choose to see it. You can't force anyone to feel it, and no one can take it from you if you have it. Only you can. She looked at the three of them. I'm telling you all of this because if you fight over him, nobody will be satisfied. If you share him under superficial conditions, nobody will be satisfied either. And if one of you wins and the others end up outside, nobody will be satisfied then either. Not even the winner. Because we're never going to be satisfied, we always want more winning, more acquiring, more growing. That is the nature of what we are, not a flaw to fix, but something to understand and work around. She let her gaze rest on each of them in turn, without urgency. If you don't start from yourselves, you won't enjoy life no matter how it turns out. You are already daughters of privilege, all three of you. You have lost a great deal of what you loved, yes, but in this city that is the rule, not the exception. The poor and weak children of this city in the same circumstances who don't have the luxury of sitting in a room like this one to discuss this exist in enormous numbers. That doesn't validate what you feel, but it does mean there are things to be grateful for before you complain. So if it's not love, but gratitude, if it's Luna conceding, or if it's sharing, those are not bad situations in your context. Make something good of them. Enjoy what they offer and find the advantages. You're not ordinary girls. You carry enormous responsibilities on your shoulders. Be mature enough not to wait for the mistake to try to understand. Understand now, from the harder place, from someone else's experience. Then she looked longer at each of them one by one. She looked at Luna first. Luna Starweaver, she said, in a tone that was serious, more direct, but without the hardness she sometimes carried when she was direct with people she considered less significant. You are going to find this easier than the others think. You already understood that you want what's best for him. You already understood that you want what's best for them too. But watch yourself for a very common mistake. Luna looked at her. If you give, give because you want to give. Not because you feel you have an outstanding debt. Not because suffering feels more honest to you than enjoying. Selfra held her gaze with enough steadiness to reach past the expression and into her soul, into wherever the younger woman was deciding things. Suffering is not more noble than happiness. It's only easier to hide. She let that sit. Embrace everything you're accepting, or don't accept it. There's no middle ground that works over time. Luna nodded once. Selfra looked at Leora. You perceive emotions with more clarity than most people. You feel them more strongly, too. That's real, and it's part of who you are. A pause. So, Leora Ashenway, you're going to have to learn that feeling something strongly doesn't make that feeling more important than everything else. Life is longer and more complex than it looks from where you're standing right now. She held Leora's eyes with the same analytical intensity that she gave Luna or anything she was genuinely trying to understand. Stop idealizing what you feel. This age is deceptive. It doesn't mean I want you to love less, but to understand you and love better. What you feel is real, but it is not the most important thing that is going to happen in your life. Leora didn't respond, but something in her shifted 1 degree. Not agreement exactly. Something more like the first contact with an idea that needed more time than it had been given. Selfra looked at Larissa last. Larissa had been expecting to be last. She had also been expecting, in the private part of herself where she ran the honest version of assessments, something in the direction of acknowledgement, that she had handled the situation with a clear head, with more maturity and forward vision than the other two. Larissa Dravenholm, you are the worst of the three. Larissa opened her mouth. Not because you've done anything wrong, Selfra continued, without giving her room to respond yet, but because you hide the most. You've been behind political logic in this entire matter, as though that made you objective. She looked at Larissa directly, the same unsparing attention she had given the other two. It doesn't make you objective. It makes you the only one who hasn't said a single thing that was truly hers. Larissa closed her mouth. You would have been the first to stab the other two in the back if you believed that doing so meant keeping him for yourself permanently. Said without cruelty or contempt, a diagnosis, not a condemnation. Not because you're a bad person, but because you repress a huge obsession instead of bringing it out and working through it. You repress it so well that when it breaks open, a pause, and it always breaks open without warning, you will regret it. Her eyes didn't move from Larissa's. Cry when you need to cry. Feel what you feel instead of immediately converting it into work. That doesn't make you weak. Your situation is the opposite of Leora's. Give more weight to your own internal desires. A longer pause. But remember the same thing I told Leora. Feeling isn't the most important thing. In repressing, it doesn't make you stronger. It only makes you more dangerous, to yourself and to the people near you. Larissa pressed her teeth together and fixed her eyes on a point on the wall. Something in them went slightly glassy before she managed the rest of it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Mayo, who had been quiet for longer than anyone in the room could have reasonably asked her to be quiet, looked at Selfra with something that was close to genuine respect. "In you," she said, quietly for once, without the teasing tone, as always. 400 years and all of that. How are you managing it? Selfra looked at her, then looked at the recovered arm, still learning to be hers again. Terribly, she said, and smiled, the smile of someone who has arrived at a certain peace with an answer that isn't the one they would have chosen, but that is the honest one. But that's my problem, and I prefer it that way. Chapter 1022, Taming Impossible Puzzles 6. Ren had been cursing himself for a while. Not out loud. The internal kind, the kind one did when tracing the chain of decisions that had brought them to a specific point and finding at each step a previous version of themselves who had made a choice with good intentions and insufficient information about the consequences. The Ren who had made a promise to Leora. The he who had made a promise to Larissa. The he who had assumed things would resolve themselves. The Ren who had made a promise to Luna. The Ren who had believed that being kind and not leaving anyone out was simply the right approach, and that the complications would come later, and that later was a future problem. Okay, the future had arrived. His parents were in the room, collecting the last of their things. They had been at the castle since after the battle. First because neither of them had moved from Ren's side while he was unconscious, which had been its own extended and difficult period, And then because the castle staff treated them as VIPs, and neither of them had found sufficient reason to argue with that. But the house in a noble district that Run had bought for them had been sitting empty for weeks with employees who hadn't been paid, and Rin was going to return to the academy soon, which meant the natural moment to leave was this one. His mother folded clothes with the efficiency of someone who had done this in enough different spaces to have developed a system. His father checked that nothing had been left behind with the expression of someone who was actually thinking about something else entirely, but needed his hands occupied while he did it. The embraces arrived the way they always arrived, with the warmth of people who had known you before you were anyone and who therefore carried a version of you that no one else was ever going to have. His mother took his face between her hands and looked at him the special way she checked that he was still the same person. His father gave him the kind of pat on the back that fathers gave when they had too much to say and didn't know how to say any of it, and the pat had to carry all of it. But, Dad, Reed stopped with the bag halfway lifted. Can you stay for a moment? Reed looked at Fern. Fern looked at Reed. Then she looked at Ren with the expression of someone who had understood exactly what this was about and had decided it could wait in the next room. Call me when you're done, she said, and walked out with the bag Reed had left halfway, and with the composure of someone who was not even slightly curious. Reed sat down. Ren sat across from him. Inside Reed Pattender's head, there was cursing as well. Quieter than Ren's internal cursing, but with the same structure, a chain of moments where he had assumed that the difficult father conversations were going to arrive in forms he had seen in other fathers and had more or less prepared himself for, and that instead they were arriving in forms for which no preparation existed because his son was not the kind of situation for which manuals had been written. Ren began to talk. Reed listened. 3 girls. Promises that had grown in the course of things and had run into each other. The important point, he didn't want 2 of them to step away from his life if he chose one. Reed processed that for a moment. Internally, he thought that this would have been a more manageable situation if Ren had brought it to Fern, who had opinions about everything and delivered them with a clarity that Reed had always admired and occasionally found exhausting. But Ren had brought it to him, and that specifically, the fact that it was him Ren had chosen to ask, made him feel like Ren was still the small boy he had taught to read, and not the person the highest-ranked officials of the city now requested audiences with. If he wanted to keep feeling like Ren's father, not just technically, but genuinely, he couldn't fail him in this. He opened his mouth. Ren kept explaining before he could speak, because Ren always explained more than he needed to when he was nervous, and what arrived over the next several minutes was the complete picture with all of its colors. All 3 of them. What had happened during the crisis and the internal connection he had felt when their energies aligned in the way they had. What he had said to each of them and what he believed each of them felt, and what he believed he felt, described with the particular awkwardness of someone working through emotions they don't yet have a fully acceptable vocabulary for, because using certain words still made him feel shy, but the shape of what he meant was coming through regardless. What was also clear was how much all 3 of them had done for him. The weight of that was present in everything he said. Reed listened to all of it. He could see his son's situation clearly enough. Actually, 3 girls was few, relative to the options that existed. Since even when Ren wasn't home, nobles continued arriving at the house with offers and their daughters, the kind that came packaged with large sums and rare materials and promises of mansions and strategic alliances. Fern was curt with all of them in a way that Reed found, privately, deeply satisfying. She minimized every offer as something Ren could easily obtain on his own, and that he was simply above, which was her way of communicating that no one in this house was for sale. Reed agreed with her entirely, but he still couldn't help being impressed by the scale of what people were offering. Yet those weren't the 3 girls his son was talking about. When Ren finished, there was silence. Then Reed was still organizing his thoughts when the next difficult question arrived. Did you ever think about anyone else besides Mom? Chapter 10:23, Taming Impossible Puzzles, 7. Did you ever think about anyone else besides Mom? Reed looked at the door, then at the other door, then at the window, as though Fern might also be at the window. His father was going into mental overdrive. Ren could see it happening in real time, the look of someone who had never faced this particular category of problem and was trying to find solid ground to stand on. Reed had found Fern by the luck of proximity and shared circumstances, the two of them growing up close enough in the poorest part of the district that the options had been what they were. They were both reasonably good-looking, which had helped, and being poor had never left room for the kind of thinking that involved maintaining more than one household. Not when your own wife was helping cover expenses and you were barely managing that. No, honestly, we were to focus on having someone like you, that all our young years were gone when we realized. Because of your isolated situation and mom's situation, Run continued, with the careful delicacy he had when he was touching something he thought might be slightly disrespectful. Not at all, right? Now that I'm thinking about how you two are, asking someone like you this question feels wrong, and the past in which Fern had had trouble conceiving was one in which the issue of feeling less and talking about other partners had existed, but that story had ended in mutual support so as not to destroy the value of what they had. But Reed realized that this was not helping his son in any useful way, so he left most of that out. No, he said, but not because other girls didn't appeal to me. Being young and living where we lived. He ran a hand over his head and scratched the side apologetically. Your mother appealed to me considerably more than anyone else. It just wasn't a hard choice for me. Rin nodded, thought for a moment. If you had needed to choose between two girls who were her equals, he said, who you liked practically the same amount, both of whom you knew well, both of whom had done a great deal for you, both of whom cared about you, how would you choose? Reed swallowed. The questions settled into the space between them and stayed there with the weight of questions that don't have answers, not because nobody has thought about them hard enough, but because they weren't designed to have answers. They were designed to make you sit with the discomfort of not having one. Reed thought about it, not quickly, with the honesty of someone who understood that his son needed something real, not something comforting. Being poor, he said at last, in the voice of someone finding the right words in the right order. Honestly, you can't think about more than one wife without thinking about starving. So I never thought about it that way. I'm sorry, that's just the truth. A pause. Rin started to open his mouth, but Reed kept going. But I understand what you're asking. It's natural for men to find women attractive. Nobody I know is outside that. Nobody. He looked at his son directly. Well, I can tell you with certainty, and this is the most serious thing I've said to you in a long time. Life with a partner is not all love, and it is not easy. If you multiply that more than once, a pause that carried its own weight, you've been warned about the consequences. Rin swallowed. You're right, he said. I need to think about this very carefully. Yes, said Reed. And for the first time in the conversation, he sounded like the father of someone who was about to make a potentially very costly mistake. Yes, so you need to tell them. The door opened. Reed jumped out of the chair with the reflex of someone who had been responding to that specific sound in that specific way for decades. Fern was in the doorway. She didn't have the face Reed had been mentally preparing for during the last several minutes. No crossed arms. No temperature in her eyes. Not the particular quality of stillness that in Fern preceded things one preferred she not precede. She was looking at Run. Don't be a coward, she said. If you want something, pursue it with conviction and don't waver. Reed and Rin looked at her simultaneously with the same square-eyed expression. Fern walked in, closed the door behind her, and sat beside Reed with the composure of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say what she had to say and had calculated that this was precisely that moment. A few days ago, Selfra and Victor consulted me about something, she said, in the direct tone she used when there was no reason for detours. And Julius had already been sending messages to the house before regarding that too. It wasn't the first time nobles had arrived with offers designed to connect themselves to Run. She had encountered enough of them, with their mansions and their sums and their rare materials, to have a practical understanding of what a mistress was. But those conversations had been about mistresses. The messages from Julius and the consultation with Selfra and Victor were about something structurally different. Official wives, connecting houses to the Draven homes or the Ashenways. The scale was not comparable. Reed looked ahead with the expression of someone who had just understood why his wife had found all of those earlier offers so unimpressive. Wait, then she was just selling to a bigger, Rin said nothing. What's behind this decision is not an ordinary partnership, continued Fern, looking at her son with the attention she had always had for him, the kind that educated more directly than lectures. It's something larger than that. A pause. I couldn't imagine sharing your father. And under our circumstances, someone giving him a child before I could bring you would have destroyed younger me, she said, and Reed found immediate reasons to study the wall with great interest. But our life was far from that kind of world. I couldn't live with that. Not unless he were at least a king. Reed, deflated, would have spouted if drinking tea. But you are a dragon, my dragon, said Fern, with the calm of someone stating a geographic fact. And King falls short of you. Silence. Several young ladies can fit in a dragon's mouth, she continued. And in those words there was the echo of someone who had spoken a very similar sentence in different circumstances. As long as you respect them, as long as you care for them and want what's best for them. And if connecting yourself to all the great houses of this city is part of what that implies. She looked at him. That is no less than what you deserve. She held his gaze. But if you decide to do it, stand tall and firm before that responsibility, without wavering. Ren looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his father. Reed was also looking at Fern, with the expression of someone who had been married to a person for more than 40 years and still occasionally encountered a version of them they hadn't met yet. Then Reed looked at Ren. The two of them looked at each other. The same thought was clearly moving through both of their minds simultaneously, the thought that there were people in the world who were completely unpredictable in ways that defeated any prior preparation, and that one of those people was sitting between looking perfectly calm about it. They both exhaled. At the same moment, with the affectionate resignation of two people who loved the same woman and who, in this specific moment, in front of her, had absolutely nothing to add. Fern looked at both of them. What? She said. Chapter 1024, Taming Impossible Puzzles, and packing wasn't complicated. Rin did it using the Wolverine's extended space with enough practice behind him that the process ran almost automatically while he thought about other things. The materials he had accumulated. The documents Julius had insisted on delivering in person, which carried a political weight, Rin was still processing in the background. The few personal items he had taken out to work through, process, and cultivate in the recovery room, which now returned to their organized places in the beast space. All of it went in without needing his full attention, which was convenient because his full attention was occupied with a problem that had no dimensional storage solution. Min appeared in the doorway with the naturalness of someone who hadn't knocked, because knocking would have been admitting he might not have been welcome. So what are you going to do? Rin tensed. Not visibly. But Min had known him long enough to catch the fraction of a second too long before he answered. Visit all the known ruins, said Rin, without stopping the sorting. Get the materials I'll need to make the runes that aren't on the market. See how far I can push in the platinum ring now that my beasts are stronger. Look at how corruption has been affecting different surface and underground zones. Min laughed. Rin looked at him confused. So you're running from them, said Min. I didn't expect that from you. I don't know what you're talking about. I have important things to do, and... Yes, said Min, nodding with the gravity of someone taking something extremely seriously that they were not taking seriously at all. Very important things, like the problem of the 3 female dragons who are going to tear you apart when they find you. He laughed again. Rin closed the Wolverine's dimensional space, dropped onto the bed face up, and stared at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had concluded that the ceiling was the only element of the room with no opinions about his life. Min came over and sat on the edge of the bed with the energy of someone who was going to enjoy this conversation and wasn't bothering to hide it. Why don't you just face them at once? You could probably defeat all 3 of them together if it were a combat exam. Rin looked at him with narrowed eyes. I know you're not roaring, said Min, before Rin could respond. But I think you have a genuinely good opportunity here to accomplish something he could only dream of. Min, tell me. Rin exhaled. Honestly, he said, with the voice of someone being more truthful than he had planned to be, because the alternative was sustained discomfort indefinitely. It's not that I don't understand roaring. The instinct exists in me, too. I have a big curiosity about those things, obviously. A pause. but I can't stop feeling embarrassed just thinking about something like this. And even less do I want to imagine the consequences of suggesting it. Having them look at me with contempt and never speak to me again. Min laughed with that laugh of someone constructing a very vivid mental image. Yes, he said, I can picture that clearly. That doesn't help me at all. Look, that would be the result if I asked for something like that. Min waved a hand. You're different. If you stand in front of them and tell them honestly that you don't want to choose, maybe they even offer options or at least give you time. A pause, which would mean you don't have to run and have them hunt you down to kill you and divide your remains equally. Rin looked at the ceiling again. I was also thinking that, he admitted. The talk about running was just, I'd like to procrastinate a little longer. He muttered something that sounded like curses to several past Rins in an unfavorable tone. I don't want to be the last Ren of the future who inherits the obligation of resolving all these unresolved things from his past selves. Min nodded with the performative gravity of someone who understood the weight of the situation and also found it very entertaining. I'm going back to the academy normally, said Min, standing up. I'll ask to join Zhao's group. Taro and the others will be there. He looked at Ren. When you come back, I hope you'll join us. Good luck. Ren nodded. Min walked to the door. Opened it. I've held them up long enough, he said, toward the corridor. All three of them took their mantles off and came in. From the corridor behind them, Mayo gave Min's hand a high five with the energy of someone completing a successful mission. Good work, she said. Min smiled. Traitor, thought Run, loudly enough for the thought to be heard in his face. He sat up on the bed, looked at all three of them, and swallowed with some difficulty. He remembered his mother. Stand tall and firm. He remembered his father. You've been warned about the consequences. He remembered Min. They'll give you time if you're honest. He breathed deeply, got to his feet, raised his gaze with the composure of someone who had made a decision and was going to execute it. Then he went slightly red thinking about Roran, but he cleared his throat, pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment, then exhaled one last time and asked, in the most neutral voice he could construct with the time available. H, how can I help you? We came to put all things on the table, said Larissa, with the ease of someone who had prepared this. So this doesn't keep moving forward without order or any kind of rules. Rin swallowed. What do you mean by this? Leora put a hand on his shoulder. You can't wait until you've kissed all of us to make a decision. Rin went completely rigid. The room had the specific silence of a space where a significant number of people were watching to see how someone responded to something. From the corridor, where the maids and guard were still clearly present, because Mayo didn't have the physiological capacity to remove herself when something interesting was happening and was transmitting that inability to everyone near her, came the kind of quiet that people produced when they were actively trying not to make noise. This was the moment. There was no more time to run from the decisions of past Rens. So Ren straightened. All three of you are beautiful, he said, and bit the inside of his cheek with discretion. And all three of you have done a great deal of stuff for me. So right now I'm not comfortable deciding the exact form of our future. We're young. We have a whole life ahead. So I'm asking you for time to think and to develop as. All three of them laughed. Ren looked at them. What? Leora was joking. You don't need to be so serious, said Larissa. Ren looked at Leora. Leora nodded with the face of someone who was not remotely sorry. Ren exhaled. You can take as much time as you need, said Larissa, in the tone of someone closing a negotiation they had already prepared. But we came to an agreement, and we wanted you to know about it. Ren looked at her, already more relaxed, and nodded. You marry all three of us, or none of us. Ren's brain shut down. Not metaphorically. It was a physical and specific process in which information arrived at the processing system. The system received it, and the system decided it needed a moment to locate its metaphorical glasses before continuing reading the commands. He looked at Larissa as if asking for confirmation. Larissa nodded with complete seriousness. He moved his head as if his neck were a machine that needed oil and looked at Luna. Luna had gone red. She was looking slightly to the side, but she nodded too. Finally, he looked at Leora. Leora was smiling the large smile of someone who knew that what had just happened was exactly what she had wanted to happen. She also nodded. That said, Leora added, You can't add anyone else while you're taking your time to think about it. Or you lose the 3-for-1 offer. Ren sighed, then straightened to his full height with the dignity of a dragon his mother had described correctly. He told them that being the case, with the three of them being the only people who mattered to him among everyone he had ever met, including the girls from social studies, he accepted the offer without hesitation. He embraced all three of them. He lifted them, and there was probably even some dramatic lighting from somewhere. But that was only in the version of events that Ren's brain constructed in the second immediately following their announcement. In the actual version, Ren went completely rigid, produced something unintelligible, and disappeared. The shadow step took him to the corridor, which was full of maids and guards and mayo, so it immediately took him further, and the process of finding a location without witnesses required 3 additional jumps because the castle turned out to be inconveniently populated in every direction he tried. There's no way I'm doing anything like that in front of everyone, especially not in front of Mayo, not in front of the guards, not in front of anyone with eyes. He ended up in a section of the garden that was usually empty, back against a wall, his heart operating at a rate that no tamer should be sustaining without an active beast involved. Who am I kidding? I couldn't even act intimate with one of them in front of the other 2. Just thinking about having that kind of conversation with all 3 of them at the same time had done something to the regulation systems that normally functioned well under pressure. A private conversation with one of them, heart rate elevated. 2 simultaneously, probable system failure. All 3 at once. Heart explodes, certain death. He felt 3 presences, each one with their specific mana signature, recognizable because he had spent enough time in proximity to all 3 of them that his system registered them before his mind had to do the conscious work. The particular weight of Luna's shadow energy, the clean precision of Larissa's light, the warmth of Leora's fire. All 3 of them were approaching. With fast jumps, Rin surveyed the garden, calculated escape routes, and cursed every past run who had made decisions that had put him in this position again. End of transition arc. Chapter 1025, Taming Diamond Beasts. 1,110 days to get here. 3,000 from the beginning, from the day the cultivation journey started. Nearly 3 years since he had walked into 6th grade and into the battle against Orion. General Ren hadn't just counted the days. He had lived them, which was different, and the difference showed in the way his body moved now, at speeds that would once have required conscious direction and now simply happened, the way breathing happened, the way balance happened, the way it only became genuinely fun to reach half the velocity needed to break the sound barrier while mounted on his enormous golden mantis, the air parting around them with a sound that had no good description except cutting the storm. The world had expanded enormously, and in that new world, the Fire Mountain had been watching him from the distance for a few hours now, with a specific indifference of geography that didn't know time existed. But today, the Guardian was going to know that Ren existed. Now an important military leader at the wall, betrothed to the 3 most prominent houses of Yano/Yino, and a few months after his mantis reached Gold 1. Ren had taken a few days to test what that meant in practice. Around 1 year of cultivation still remained before his mushroom reached Platinum 1. But with the mantis at Gold 1, the Wolverine at Gold 2, and the Hydra at Gold 3, the threshold he'd been approaching for a long time had finally opened. The 3-way fusion. It wasn't like the fusions other double tamers used. Conventional fusion divided the beasts into equal portions and assembled something that was half of each, structurally coherent in the language of the runes precisely because the division was clean and the result had a clear shape that wasn't too hard to translate both ways. Both halves present, both contributing, the configuration readable. But a beast that was 1/3 of each of 3 different sources risked losing the coherence that made each organism functional. 3 languages in the same sentence. All 3 present, none of them fully itself. The grammar breaking down at the seams where they tried to coexist. So this fusion worked differently. The strongest beast, in this case the Hydra, was the foundation. The other 2 amplified it from inside, adding their capacities to the existing structure rather than fragmenting it. The Hydra didn't become less itself. It became the frame within which the others could express what they were without any of them losing the thread of what they were. The Hydra had 3 heads, finally. The Wolverine gave the prismatic elemental quality, that multicolored property that turned the diamond scales into something that caught light from every angle simultaneously, each facet holding a different frequency, the whole surface alive with it. The Mantis gave her wings and her edge, and beyond those the precise sense of multi-eyed angle and timing that let 3 separate heads coordinate as though they were one mind with 3 perspectives looking outward from it. The wings emerged from the fused beast back with the span required to move that much mass through the air at speeds that the size would have made impossible to anyone who didn't understand how power bonuses and mana rewrote the rules. Even as a result of the fusion, functional in the way that things were functional when they had been grown for a purpose rather than added to one. Ren's primary beast existed within that fusion in the only place where it made sense. At the convergence point of the 3 beast systems, not yet awake, but serving as the central node, the root system that everything else grew from. Still dormant, but still present since the day it had decided to wait. The power of the fusion reached levels Run could feel rather than calculate. His perception multiplied across 4 simultaneous viewpoints, not switching between them, but holding all at once, the way a chord held all its notes rather than playing them in sequence. His reaction times compressed to the point where the familiar gap between thinking and moving closed into something continuous. Its system was so entangled that it was the first time Ren could merge with the power and say with certainty that he understood what his beasts experienced in fusion. Not as a concept, not as something he had inferred, but as an immediate fact. The fullness of it. The quality of being more than one thing without being confused about what you were. It was enormous. The guardian of the Fire Mountain was technically a dragon, but not in the strict sense. It was what the records Julius had obtained from Dragarian's archives described as a diamond fire dragon of 100 years, unique in its species across that century, while it gathered sufficient energy to scale to the next sub-ring in diamond territory. The first form of a true dragon. The stage at which the creature absorbed the full power of an ecosystem, where the component elements hadn't yet fully unified and the body still carried the marks of that ongoing integration. Something becoming itself, not yet finished, the process visible in the way the form shifted slightly, depending on where you looked. A guardian that needed to live alongside the mountain it protected to stabilize its form and power before attempting the next level. Diamond 1. The accumulated power of 10 platinum beasts, or 100 gold beasts, enclosed in a single entity. Lava and red crystal in proportions that shifted depending on the angle. The deep internal heat visible through the crystalline surface in patterns that moved, slow and constant, as though the creature's own circulation was geological. The dorsal spine was expressed as ridges of volcanic rock, each one big enough to have its own local name. The scale of it requiring distance to understand correctly. The eyes carrying the temperature of white light that didn't blink because something burning at that level couldn't blink or stop seeing, couldn't feel the fraction of a second that other creatures spend in darkness between one look and the next. A fire dragon, which looked more like a huge salamander with some dragon-like characteristics and a body made of lava and red crystals. The Fire Mountain's territory was the Guardian's territory. And the mountain had been here long enough that the records answer the question of how long with long enough that the numbers are no longer the relevant point. The approaching figure on the golden mantis from a distance that should have been safe, and Ren could already feel the wind from the altitude, had a heat in it. Not the ambient warmth of the mountain itself, which existed as background, but the concentrated heat of something powerful. A complete picture assembled from 4 simultaneous readings. Ren smiled. He hadn't come here for the territory. He had come here because this was the next necessary objective. He pushed the fusion deeper. The mountain watched. The Guardian moved. Chapter 1026, Taming Diamond Beasts 2. Facing an entity like this with a Gold 3 beast would have been suicide. The Hydra at Gold 3 was essentially just 30% of the strength a Platinum 1 beast would be. 0.3 of 1 platinum, if the fraction was written plainly. But the combined bonuses of Ren's 4 beasts reached already 1,000% across several categories. Strength, 1,050%. Defense, 1,050%. Regeneration, 1,030%. Speed, 1,010%. Penetration and lethality, 1,010%. Also 950 points of elemental control and an omni boost to vitality, mana, perception, etc. of 870%, around 10 times stronger than what his beasts would be in their wild states. The arithmetic then, 0.3 multiplied by 10 equaled 3, equivalent to Platinum 3, which was 30% of a diamond rank entity's power. In isolation, not enough. But with the fusion multiplying his effective power by 4, the actual number landed at around diamond 1.2, or 20% above a common or wild diamond 1, which was precisely the opponent standing across from him right now. For as long as the fusion held, they had the advantage. The fire dragon had felt the Hydra's arrival from the moment she fused at the border of the last platinum ring, that surge of combined energy registering across the mountain's territorial awareness the way a shift in tectonic pressure registered, not heard, simply known by the vibration. It had tracked the approach on the way down, watching the trajectory of something that moved directly toward it with the arrogance of a creature that didn't fear what it was facing and hadn't yet been given reason to reconsider. The Guardian decided that something arriving with that hubris deserved a proper welcome. It drew a bit more power than usual from the mountain it protected, the absorption visible as a deepening of the heat shimmer in the air around it. Not steam, not smoke, but a visible distortion of temperature at a scale where the air itself had to compensate with storms somewhere else. The breath accumulated in the Guardian's thoracic cavity with a sound that wasn't quite a sound, more a variation in pressure and temperature, also perceptible kilometers away. The enormous power registered in the inner ear before the eyes confirmed it. Ren and his Hydra landed. The size difference between the beasts was visible from any angle without needing to calculate it. The Guardian was a mountain that existed at its own scale, and the rest of the landscape organized itself around it. The Hydra was a hill that existed on the slope, and that comparison had a concrete physical reality that the bonuses and fusion multipliers compensated for in terms of energy, but that the eye continued registering as what it was, for times smaller, at minimum, in the dimensions that mattered. They had arrived in time to see the last moment before the Guardian released its power, the throat visibly distended, the heat around it no longer ambient, but directional, every one of its 300 tons of a head oriented toward the two things that had landed in front of it and declared themselves by their presence. The most feared attack of the superior race. The breath of a dragon. It wasn't fire in any conventional sense. It was the equivalent of a volcanic eruption of epic proportions compressed and directed, the energy of magma and red crystal released in the time it took a creature of that scale to exhale. A restructuring of the thermodynamic reality of the space it crossed, the air itself becoming something different and temporarily uninhabitable for anything that was not just the concept of heat regulation. The world between the two combatants became a bright thing. But the three heads of the Hydra coordinated with the automaticity of a system built to function exactly that way. Three simultaneous angles of perception, producing an interlaced flow that no single-headed beast could have executed. They fired. Light with the added properties of elemental ice, the combination that was the natural inversion of the Guardian's fire crystal breath. The elemental opposite, not simply by category, but in the specific geometric relationship between their frequencies. The counter also wasn't trying to match the volume of the breath. It was aimed at the central angle where the effectiveness of a counter was highest, where the breath's internal pressure was most vulnerable to disruption from within rather than opposition from the outside. The rays hit the incoming breath before it could reach its target, driving into the center of it, splitting the column down its axis. The sound produced by three synchronized rays compressed into a single point was in the category of sounds that made beasts retreat twice as far as they had retreated when they first sensed the arrival of the mana. Sharp in a frequency that was not purely acoustic but energetic. The Guardian's breath was a volcanic mega-eruption. The Hydra's counter was a divine sentence. The two things met in the space between the two combatants with the violence of incompatible energies arriving at a point where neither could retreat, because retreating meant surrendering the pressure that was the only thing keeping either of them alive in the exchange. The eruption pushed. The counter ray answer harder. From inside the Hydra's eyes, the point wherein existed as architect and engine simultaneously, three angles of perception showed him the same thing. The counter was gaining. Not comfortably. Not with the ease of something that had been much more superior. The Guardian had the mountain behind it, the full, deep reservoir of an ecosystem full of fire mana, feeding its output in real time. The advantage of something fighting in its own territory with its roots in the ground beneath them. Every second of the exchange, more came. But the rays had located what they had been cataloging since the first second of the encounter. The Guardian's red crystal structure wasn't uniform. It had zones of lower density, visible in the temperature variations that three simultaneous angles of perception had been mapping from the moment they landed, the differential heat signatures that told the story of how the creature had formed and where the formation was thinnest. The three heads had been building toward those coordinates since before the exchange began. They found them. The rays adjusted fractionally, the angle changing in a small way that no external observer would have noticed, but that the Guardian structure understood immediately as a different quality of pressure. So they pushed harder and held their ground. What followed wasn't the end of the battle. It was too early for the end, but it was the point where the Guardian understood that what stood in front of it was not an ordinary challenger attempting to seize its mountain. Rin felt it too. The difference between a fight you were losing, a fight that was even, and a fight where the margin belonged to you rather than to the opponent. This was the third. The wings opened completely, full span, the mantis's gift expressing itself in the architecture of a creature that now needed what those wings had been designed to provide. The Hydra rose onto her rear legs. The Guardian, for the first time in a span, that was a question whose answer no longer mattered as much as the simple fact of it being the first time, tilted its 300 tons of neck toward the target, moving upward and recalculated. Ren thought about how different this was from the situation 2 years ago. The power he carried now had been worth every one of the 3,000 days that had built it, each one contributing something to the sum that was here right now. This moment, this specific exchange with something that deserved everything he had brought. After getting this elemental ring, only 2 more would be needed. The second phase of the exchange began. Chapter 1027, Taming Chronology. Day 2000 since Run had begun his cultivation journey. A few months after the Orion situation, Ren had advanced his primary beast to Gold 2. Thanks to that, he finally finished repairing Luna's mother's crystal. The crystal had taken several dozen sessions to recover the brightness it had possessed before, and it hadn't been able to surpass 90%. Not perfect brightness. Not until Run had accumulated a little more knowledge and a little more power. Then he was finally able to hit that 100% restoration. He had wanted to know whether at that point he could reinsert the crystal into the statue that had lost it, but that would require opening the last door of the Starweaver ruins and finding out whether said statue was among what lay behind it. And the door also required 3 enormous platinum cores, of which 2 were still missing. But at least the brightness it had possessed before Orion, that it had back. The expression on Luna's face when she held it that afternoon was not one Ren described out loud. It was the kind that didn't need words, and Ren had thoroughly enjoyed the gratitude that followed in several different ways. Shortly after, the opportunist nobles and the Knight faction, both now significantly weakened, had handed over the platinum core they held as part of the post-war agreements, along with free access to the ruins that had produced the water and fire crystals. Only the nucleus that was almost certainly in the ruins, guarded by Sirius's statue, and the corrupted beasts remained. But first, there was a significant benefit to the newly free access to those ruins. It placed the 2 crystallized figures within those ruins, one person apparently from Yino, and one with gold crest features, within Ren's operational reach for the first time since the Sirius problem had existed. He had read their systems over the weeks prior. He knew the maps. He had brought every tool available. The ruins had the specific silence of places where something large had happened long enough ago that the echo had become atmosphere. The two crystallized figures in their positions inside the main chamber were invaluable to anyone who could use them, and the only person who understood the full context of that, what they implied, was Rin. He managed to repair and reinsert the water and fire hearts. That part worked with little to no trouble. But the regression was a different conversation. He focused the first experiment on the right-hand little finger of one of the statues. The smallest available target, the lowest relative complexity, the smallest cost of error. With Machido at Gold 2, with all the accumulated practice from Selfra and Victor, with the complete map of the statue's system read and reread over the preceding weeks. He used his double gold fusion and nearly passed out. The result? A fraction of a fingernail, with its respective small piece of little finger, were transformed back. Living tissue for a few minutes before the disconnection from the rest of the statue cut the circulation, and what he had recovered died in his hands. Not pleasant. A terrible result. It was, however, a piece of the information he needed. At his current level, he could reverse this process in small fragments. What he couldn't do was keep those fragments alive without unlocking the entire circulatory network that sustained them, and that network required reversing the process at a scale his system couldn't yet reach. The whole thing at once, as he had suspected, not section by section, not piece by piece, but simultaneously across every system that needed the others to function. The difference between Selfra and Victor, who had their central system free and their most important organs functional, and a statue that had no active system at all, was the difference between reading 1,000-step code against knowing all the steps from memory and being able to recite them forward and backward at high speed, or like having to write code for the first time from nothing while keeping the first line running. He needed to grow considerably more, a faster and more expansive mental capacity, more power, more precision, more everything. He had to be much more than he was to get anything better than small pieces of the people he wanted to save. At least that conclusion wasn't as devastating as it might have been. The hope remained alive because the result had been alive, even if only briefly, and the girls made that clear to him with an attitude that grew progressively more affectionate. The girls had been losing their embarrassment at a rate that was inversely proportional to the time passing and to the embarrassment Ren continued having at full intensity. The day Ren had attempted the tactical retreat from the castle garden and found 3 pairs of feet following his shadow steps closely with a determination that he would have genuinely admired in another context. He had announced screaming that he would speak with each of them one at a time, that he accepted the responsibility of making them happy, as his mother had said, but that he needed time for this, not to produce the emotional equivalent of attempting a 3-way fusion without having the beasts at the correct rank. After that, the girls grew progressively braver. Watching him go red gave them somewhere to put their own nervousness, and they discovered that the conditions suited them better than they had expected. Bothering him as a team, they found, was significantly more enjoyable than facing him individually. Ren did not find this particularly fair. But the solution, revenge, he had found to balance the situation was not one they found particularly bad either, and it was the only arrangement that let all 4 of them keep growing without anyone accumulating too much advantage over the others. Because Ren was also learning and maturing in that area, thanks to this. So his retaliation consisted of, every time he had time alone with one of the 3, or every time he completed something significant, he became more assertive than his current level of facial redness would have suggested was possible. The day he repaired Luna's crystal, Ren had made her regret having teased him together with Larissa and Leora, though the end of the altercation was pleasant for both parties. Chapter 1028, Taming Chronology 2. Ren was fighting back. His father's chivalrous advice, filtered through the logic of his age, the advice of his classmates, of dubious practical value but offered with great confidence, and something that was his own, that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. All of it combined to produce a version of Ren in those situations that each of the 3 girls, separately, found consistently unexpected in the most productive sense of the word. But together they always found a way to return the favor, with the frequency and enthusiasm of people who had found a preferred hobby and had no intention of releasing it. They could embarrass him indefinitely by referring to him collectively as funny exaggerated, or maybe not in their honest minds. Things like, our gallant savior, king of the crystals, chivalrous knight of love, and so on, alluding to the promises made and the fact that they would catch him eventually. Always together, always at maximum volume, always coordinated. But Ren had discovered, with some surprise, that the repetition of this stopped working the way embarrassment was supposed to work. Each day, it gave him less redness and more determination. Each reminder was a pending chapter on the list of things that needed to be completed before the list of things he actually wanted could begin. 3 reminders of things he wanted to achieve turned out to be a different kind of engine than any he had used before. There were still minor obstacles in the castle, and some within the Ashenway family that couldn't significantly affect things for now, at least until the moment came to formalize everything. But to reach that moment, Ren had asked for time. He wanted first to give them everything they were missing, everything he could obtain with his maximum effort. The girls, one by one, had been relatively easy prey for that argument. Leora understood that for Larissa and Luna, having their parents present at the ceremony would mean something even bigger. As for herself, that one hadn't been a day of gallant Ren being particularly bold where she was concerned, but she still played by very helpfully assisting the other 2 with their revenge. Ren was living a happy adolescence, but he had to master the crystals. That was where both lists ended. Around 2,200 days since Ren had begun his cultivation journey, the 7th year of Academy arrived with the feeling of something outside, changing category rather than level. The outer rings were different from before, not only in how dangerous they were, but in the way the ecosystem functioned within them. The corruption filtering up from underground through the territory had found ways of consuming the silver and gold ring ecosystems that were less like direct invasion and more like accumulated influence. The way a tide changed a shoreline through repetition rather than through any single wave. The Tamers who operated there regularly collecting materials encountered a presence that was different from the one the rings had always carried, active hostility of something that had decided it wanted them gone. The Mantis reached Silver 2 on day 2190. Ren didn't celebrate much. It wasn't enough to change anything yet. The following month, the Hydra reached Gold 2. This time, with both improvements combined, the picture was a little more promising. The first thing Ren verified was the effect on his crystal work, specifically whether the distance between where he currently was and where he needed to be for the statues had changed. What he found was that the gap had closed meaningfully. The improvement was luckily nonlinear in the way that combined bonuses were always nonlinear for him, but still far from sufficient. He accepted that and kept moving. 8th year was approaching, along with the formal announcement of Ren's betrothal to the 3 most important young women in the kingdom. The preparations Julius, Selphir, and Arturo had been building across the preceding 12 months were almost ready. That was its own kind of weight, different from the cultivation weight, but present alongside it every day. But Ren was more focused on something more immediately intense that was coming sooner, made possible by the power increase he had acquired a month before the end of 7th year. On day 2490, when his Wolverine reached Gold 2 and the Mantis reached Silver 3, Ren had what the operation required to be safe. The plan involved 10 simultaneous active fusions. It required the city walls to be covered by the people best positioned to cover them in the main group's absence, a coverage problem Julius and Arturo had spent months solving in advance. And it required coordination between people who had fought together long enough that the coordination was about execution rather than about basic understanding, the kind of synchronization that couldn't be trained in a week. The elemental dragon guarding one of the mountains at the beginning of the Diamond One ring was not the kind of adversary measured in terms of absolute difficulty. It was the kind measured in terms of how many operational systems you could sustain simultaneously in its presence without any one of the 10 failing at the wrong moment. If they could manage this, only the fire ring, the light ring, and the darkness ring would remain. With Taro, the 3 girls, Min, Lu, Zhao, Lin, Selphira, and Victor, all fused in their best available conditions, the dragon had been defeated without excessive difficulty. Not easy, but normally defeatable, and the difference between those two things was precisely the gap they had spent the previous year preparing. Every decision in those 12 months had been made with this specific threshold in mind, and the threshold had been accurate. The fourth elemental ring came into Ren's hands as a major victory, but their return nearly became a major defeat. The hybrid corrupted beast had been waiting for exactly that opening. 10 of Yano's best tamers outside the defensive perimeter for long enough that the pressure on the walls had reached the point where Julius and Arturo, without the main group, had been forced into decisions about what to hold and what to temporarily let give. The kind of decisions that consumed resources faster than they could be replaced and that left marks in the defensive structure that took weeks to repair. They arrived back barely in time. By a margin nobody would have chosen to repeat. No one knew if the corruption had gotten its objective this time. The meeting that followed had the kind of silence at the end that meant everyone had reached the same conclusion simultaneously and nobody needed to say it out loud, but someone had to say it anyway because that was the function of the silence. "We need to be stronger to send a smaller group next time," said Ren, which was the obvious conclusion and therefore the one that fell to him to put into words. Julius nodded with the expression of someone who had already expected it before they started talking, but who had needed the experience to happen so that the younger and more bold members of the group arrived at the same place without him having to push them there. Some conclusions had to be lived rather than told. The city needed better defenses against corruption. The plan had been in motion for some time. Bring every young tamer in the city who hadn't already been ruined by cultivation errors to gold rank. All of them. The entire new generations. Ren's contributions had accelerated that process in ways the numbers from before his arrival couldn't have been used to calculate. The cultivation knowledge he had spread, the techniques he had shared without treating them as proprietary, all of it compressing timelines that would otherwise have taken too long. But almost 2 years still remained before the process was complete, and 2 years was 2 years during which the corruption wasn't going to stop growing and doing what it did. The outer expeditions grew more difficult, not impossible, more difficult in the way that required more resources to produce equivalent results, which was exactly the wrong direction for a system already operating near its capacity if it wanted to accumulate enough to keep elevating so many people. 8th grade would give Ren his Mosquito at Gold 3. With that, the task of finally reaching Sirius, of doing for a complete statue what he had done for Selphra and Victor and what the experiments had confirmed was theoretically possible, might finally be within reach. Day 2600 was 3 months away. Chapter 1029, Taming the Future. Day 2500. 3 weeks left before Ren's academic life ended. He walked the main corridor of the academy with his mind at that specific point in the future and his feet in the present, which was a combination that let his mana escape a little and produce the kind of walk that people who didn't know him well described as presence. But that was actually just Ren thinking about several things simultaneously without having consciously decided what to do with his face, which had settled, without his input, into serious eyes and a slight narrowing that the ambient mana around him was making considerably more severe than intended. 3 weeks also until the formal betrothal announcement, before joining the Wall Army for a few more years. 3 weeks during which he still needed to finish determining whether his new control over crystallization had reached the point where Sirius's system could receive the intervention required to bring it back, or whether he was going to have to accept that Mosquito at Gold 3, arriving in about 3 months, was the threshold he was still missing, and that the announcement was going to precede that capacity by a margin he hoped was not too dramatic to make him feel insecure. He wanted to give himself the benefit of the doubt. He had, after all, brought down a diamond rank dragon. With help, yes, but down. The 4th dragon had gone reasonably well. It was enormous and resistant proportional to its size in both directions. More mass meant more surface for the attacks to cover. More regeneration capacity drawing from a mountain, it was connected to more raw volume of health that had to be depleted before the engagement resolved. The time it took had surprised everyone, despite the fact that they had always held the advantage in rate of fire and had known from the beginning they had everything needed to win. The pure scale of the regeneration on a body that large was a variable none of them had fully modeled in advance. Dragarian taking down 3 of these alone was genuinely something else. The dragon had taken longer than expected, but the defense they maintained had been sufficient for the group to return without serious injuries, which was the correct measure of went well in that context. The outcome was good, and they also had arrived back on time to avoid tragedy. Ren's Beast's ranks now stood at Dormant Mosquito at Gold 2, the Hydra at Gold 2, the Wolverine at Gold 2, and the Mantis at Silver 3. In power, he had surpassed the general capabilities of both Selphra and Victor, a threshold that 3 years ago would have seemed aspirational in the most generous reading. His fusion of 2 Gold 2 beasts wasn't individually more powerful than their Gold 2 and Gold 3 combinations, but the advantage of having more than 2 beasts in the configuration ultimately pushed his totals past theirs in the categories that compounded. Still, the distance between where he was and where he needed to be for the next stage was visible and concrete. 2 Gold 3 beasts weren't going to be enough to approach what Dragarian had been able to do with 2 Platinum beasts in fusion. The gap was real, and the path to closing it required time that couldn't be compressed. The 3-way fusion was still a theory. Maybe having his 3 secondary beasts at gold was enough? Mosquito at Gold 3 might be the bridge between the theory and the practice, but Mosquito at Gold 3 would arrive when it arrived and not before. Ren accelerated his pace slightly without noticing. Lu's hand landed on his shoulder from the side. Brother. Ren didn't slow down. Brother. Lu matched the pace with the ease of someone who had spent enough years alongside Ren to have calibrated exactly which walking speed corresponded to which mental state, the fast, distracted one being among the more recognizable entries in the catalog. You're frightening the younger years. Ren looked ahead, then looked to the sides. The corridor, which under normal conditions had the standard circulation of an academy, with several hundred students moving between classes, currently had a specific geometry. 2 lines of people flattened against the walls at the angle that living beings produced when something their nervous system had classified as dangerous was occupying the center of a corridor they needed to cross. The first and second years had the expression of people who had received information through their nervous systems before their minds had finished processing it, with the body responding before the interpretation caught up. The third, fourth, and fifth years had the expression of people who already knew what they were looking at and had decided the wall was a reasonable position. Some female students of various years had expressions that didn't fit neatly into the frightened category, reactions that were more accurately described as fast breathing, close to hyperventilating, or what appeared to be sudden intense warmth and red faces that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. Lu raised one eyebrow. Ren exhaled. You're right, he said. He relaxed his gaze and reduced his pace to something the younger generation's nervous systems could interpret as notable VIP walking rather than primordial manometeorological event with unknown intentions. The corridor relaxed perceptibly. Take it easy, said Lu, settling into the new rhythm without remarking on the transition. You're the strongest tamer in the city now. You made that giant dragon explode, and you still haven't reached your limit. There's no reason to be this. He made a vague, serious face gesture toward the general state Ren had been projecting without meaning to. Thank you for waking me up. You're right, we have time, said with the direct sincerity Ren used with his friends. I should relax. Lu shook his head. No, thank you. The tone of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to say something and has decided this one is good enough. For asking them to extend my enrollment last year. Being able to finish the year with everyone, that means a lot to me. Ren looked at him, leaving having only covered through 7th year. Lu continued, with the voice of someone being more honest than he usually was about things. Would have sat badly with me, forever. Like an incomplete task you carry even when there's nothing left to do about it. Well, the Wall Command wanted you as soon as possible, said Ren. But when I told them you were part of my most central and important team and that I wanted to attend graduation with you in my year, getting the extension wasn't difficult. Lu looked at him with the face of someone processing the most important and deciding whether to address it or not. I also told them I'd make sure your power increased further before we left for the wall, Rin added. Lou nodded slowly, then laughed. At this rate, one day, I'll be able to bring down one of those real diamond dragons by myself. Rin looked at him. Yes. Lou had said it in the tone used for things that sound good, but that one doesn't expect to be taken seriously, the rhetorical confidence of an ambitious statement. But Rin's yes arrived with the quality of someone who had evaluated the numbers and saw no reason to disagree. Lou swallowed hard, thinking of the harsh training and cultivation still needed for that. They had arrived at the door of the hall where Rin would spend the next hours. Lou stopped with the naturalness of someone who knew this was his point of separation, the particular ease of a routine so established that the goodbye didn't need announcing. Don't run this time, he said, with the smile of someone who had been watching a dynamic for years and found it more entertaining than he probably should. Rin laughed. Quiet, genuine, the kind that came out when something surprised him pleasantly rather than catching him off guard. I don't need to run anymore, he said, low enough that it didn't carry past Lou. But sometimes what happens when they catch you is more interesting if you pretend to be suffering a little first. Lou went red, looked ahead, then looked at Rin with the expression of someone who wasn't certain they had heard what they thought they had heard from whom they heard it. Rin was already pushing the door open, his back to Lou, without any kind of expression that would have confirmed or denied anything. Lou remained in the corridor for a moment, then continued on his way with the face of someone who had new information to process and preferred to do it in motion. Larissa was already in the classroom, not on the bench where they usually sat. She was at the front, standing next to the instructor's table with several documents spread out. She had reviewed the material enough times to have specific opinions on each section and had organized those opinions in a pedagogical order. She glanced at Ron as he entered. Chapter 1030, Taming Protocol, again. Larissa looked at Ron when he came in. You're 2 minutes late. Lou kept me. Lou always keeps you. They were alone. Rin had the theory that the absence of an audience was more convenient for Larissa than for him in these sessions, but he had never found the right moment to raise it without the moment becoming a different kind of conversation. When they had started this a few days ago, he had assumed they would have difficulty not feeling embarrassed about practicing for what was essentially the official promise that they would be getting married, but she had gone straight to the point the moment the door closed, even the first day. The betrothal ceremony has 3 phases, Larissa had said, indicating the first document. The formal presentation, which is where you speak less than your instinct is going to ask you to. The declaration of intent, which has a specific formula you need to memorize, because improvising in that moment is the equivalent of insulting every important old family present. And the exchange of seals, which is ceremonial, but where each gesture has a registered meaning you will need to execute correctly. Ren had underestimated how much she wanted this. Larissa had even convinced Luna and Leora to let her teach Ren alone with a simple argument. On the day of the betrothal, he would surprise them more with what he had learned this way. She hadn't elaborated further. She hadn't needed to, because Luna and Leora had enough judgment to know that when Larissa said something with that calm, the elaboration was a useless detail and the statement was the point. What she hadn't told them was the real reason. That run in learning mode gave her very interesting moments. The problem of memorizing the steps was the same problem it always was. Ren's perfectionist body did what it did when you gave it inefficient positions. The steps arrived at the wrong angle. The gestures had the right intention, but the execution was so stoic that a marionette would have done it more naturally. The kind of awkwardness that produced in Larissa an impulse she found difficult to contain. But the easy solution still existed. The mantis, a partial fusion, light enough to be nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it, that handed the task of translating intention into movement with the beast system. The mantis was speed, precision, and angle. And when Ren gave her the objective of copying exactly what Larissa's body was doing, she copied it with the accuracy of something that processed geometry rather than feelings. Clean and automatic. But the interesting moments weren't those. They were the ones that emerged when she gave Ren the gestures and the lines to memorize. The result was an entirely different Ren from the usual one. Confident and exact, with a physical presence and a consistency that her conscious mind would have interrupted with doubts and adjustments if she hadn't been willing to simply let the fantasy exist without questioning it. He was like a gallant protocol knight, but one who wasn't performing, only executing that same perfect fantasy with complete sincerity. A Ren who didn't know he was doing something remarkable, which was what made it remarkable. Larissa liked this version of Ren in ways she preferred not to catalog too specifically. She liked teaching him alone because Ren in focused mode responded to directions with a precision that no other tamer in the world could have matched, and because conversations in that state had a particular quality where he listened and responded without the filters that normally process his answers before they arrived. It was, in certain respects, the most honest version of Ren that Larissa knew. The exchange of seals, said Larissa, indicating the third document. The complete sequence has 7 steps. The first 3 are pure presentation of rank. The last 4 are where most betrothed parties make mistakes because the nerves arrive at exactly that point, after the first part has gone well. Ren looked at the sequence. The partial mantis fusion was perceptible to someone who knew him, something in the posture that was slightly quieter than his usual one, an economy of movement that wasn't studied but automatic, the body doing less without being asked because the beast's precision occupied the space that uncertainty normally used. Step 4, Larissa continued, demonstrating the hand position, is the one with the most significance. If you execute it incorrectly, it reads as an implicit rejection of the alliance, even when the intention was the opposite. The old families will register it before you finish the movement. Rin mirrored the position. Perfect. Larissa checked it from the angle that mattered. Good. She marked something on the document. Have you reviewed what Finch sent you about the noble inventory in the eastern Goldcrest sector? Not yet. Ren held the position while answering, the mantis not caring about parallel conversations. I have 3 weeks of reports unread from half the Goldcrest territory, 2 from the noble complaints in the northern sector, and 1 from way about the wall condition in the 4th stretch. A pause. Someone should be able to make the operational decisions without needing me to sign off on everything. You always have to give the final approval. Not a reprimand exactly, but with the firmness of someone repeating something they have said before and consider fundamental enough that repetition is part of the teaching. No matter how much you trust Way or Finch, trust doesn't replace oversight when the consequences of an error fall on you at the scale that yours do. Ren exhaled through his nose. I know. I'm just saying they make fewer mistakes than I would, and I could be doing less bureaucratic things and more stuff that needs my power or other special capabilities. Next step, said Larissa. Ren returned to focused mode and executed step 5. The politics of the betrothal were, in practical terms, considerably simpler than they would have been without the altercation having effectively eliminated the competition. Orion's faction had survived the post-war period in the state, in which structures survived when the elements sustaining them disappeared suddenly, and they didn't fully collapse. Barely functional.